If you've never spent a winter up around the back of the Barrington Tops, it's hard to explain the kind of isolation you're dealing with. It's beautiful country, thick, green grazing land, rolling ridges, and old timber fences wrapped in rusted barbed wire. But it's heavy country too. The valleys are deep, the mist hangs low until midday, and when the sun drops behind the ridges, the dark doesn't just fall, it swallows the landscape whole. Sarah wasn't a stranger to the bush. She'd bought the old grazing block, about 300 acres of undulating paddock, nearly 10 years ago after things went sideways in Newcastle. It wasn't a working station anymore. She let the neighbour run a few head of cattle on the lower paddocks, just to keep the grass down and maintain the primary fences. It was a modest setup. An old-style weatherboard house with a corrugated iron roof and a deep, wrap-around timber veranda that sat on concrete stumps. The house sat about 30 meters back from the main gravel access road, but behind the back fence, the land sloped gently downward for 300 meters across the open paddock until it hit the tree line. That tree line was the border. A deep, permanent creek ran through the gully, and on the other side of the water, the trees just rose up into the infinite, untamed canopy of the Barrington Tops National Park. For 10 years it was paradise for her two young kids, Ben and Lily. They grew up in boots, constantly exploring the paddocks, building cubbies, and spending their summer afternoons down at the creek. They had a big, thick-coated German Shepherd cross named Rusty, who went everywhere with them. It was a good life. It was a safe life, until the end of last autumn. The shift didn't happen overnight. In the bush, things don't give themselves away all at once. They leak in through the edges. It started in late April when the air began to turn crisp. Ben and Lily had headed down to the creek after school to check some yabby traps they'd set in one of the deeper pools. They came back about an hour later, earlier than usual, dragging their boots across the kitchen linoleum. "We didn't leave the traps in," Lily said, dumping her school bag on the bench. Sarah was standing at the stove, stirring a batch of soup. "Why's that? Water too high?" "No," Ben chimed in, looking out the back window toward the distant black line of the national park. "It just smells bad down there today, Mum. Like a dead kangaroo or something. Rusty wouldn't even drink from the crossing." Sarah didn't think twice about it. In that part of the world, a wallaby drags itself into the scrub to die all the time, or a feral pig gets caught in a snare down in the gully. You give it a week, the wedge-tails and the blowflies finish it off, and the wind clears the air. But a fortnight later, the kids came up from the bottom paddock with a different story. They'd been throwing rocks into the creek bed when Lily swore she saw someone standing perfectly still inside the thick temperate rainforest on the national park side of the bank. She said whoever it was tall, dark, and just watching them through the tangled lawyer vines. Sarah sat them down at the dinner table that night and gave them the usual talk. It's a national park. You get bushwalkers who lose the track, or illegal deer poachers wandering where they shouldn't be. But internally, her stomach did a slight flip. Property owners up there are tight-knit. You know every vehicle that passes the cattle grid on the main road, and nobody had reported an abandoned car or a walker missing. She told the kids to stick closer to the house yard fence for a while, just until she could mention it to the neighbor. That was the same week Rusty started changing. Rusty was a reliable yard dog. He didn't bark at the wind, and he didn't chase possums. But around mid-May, he started waking Sarah up at 2 or 3 in the morning. He'd stand at the back door of the laundry, his hackles raised like wire, emitting this low, continuous, vibrating growl that came from the absolute back of his throat. One night, After the third time the dog woke her up, Sarah had enough. She figured it was a stray dingo or a scrub bull messing with the house yard gate. She switched on the heavy floodlights that lit up the inner house yard, unbolted the laundry door, and gave Rusty the command to clear the yard. The dog bolted out onto the lawn, barking with everything he had, tearing toward the back fence line that separated the mowed grass from the open paddock. But the moment his paws hit the edge where the white floodlight dissolved into the pitch-black 300-meter paddock, Rusty stopped dead. Sarah stood on the veranda, the cold air biting through her flannel pajamas. She watched the dog. Rusty wasn't barking anymore. He had dropped his tail completely between his legs, his body pressed low to the damp grass, growling toward the dark tree line in a way she had never heard before. He took 3 steps backward, never turning his head away from the darkness, and then turned and bolted straight back up the veranda steps, pushing past her legs into the safety of the house. Sarah locked the door. She looked out into the black paddock through the kitchen window. The floodlights showed nothing but empty grass, but the feeling of being watched from the bottom of the slope was suddenly so thick it made the hairs on her arms stand up. By June, winter had set in properly. The mist stayed in the gully all day, and the kids didn't want to go down to the creek at all anymore. They didn't even ask. They stayed on the veranda or inside the house yard fence, playing with their Lego. Sarah noticed that even if they dropped a tennis ball over the timber post gate into the big paddock, Rusty wouldn't go through to get it. He'd just sit by the wire, whining, his brown eyes fixed on the distant trees. The first physical piece of reality arrived on a freezing Thursday morning. Sarah was driving the kids down the driveway to catch the school bus at the main road when she noticed something grey lying in the middle of the grass paddock, about halfway down the slope to the creek. On her way back up to the house, she parked the farm ute, put her boots on, and walked out into the wet grass to check it. It was a full-grown swamp wallaby, but it hadn't been killed by wild dogs, and it hadn't been struck by a car. The animal had been completely broken. Its ribcage was crushed inward, as if something immense had simply stepped on it, or squeezed it until the bone fractured, and the thick hide on its neck had been torn open with an incredible, blunt force. There were no neat canine puncture wounds. It looked like it had been handled by hands that didn't know their own weight. Rusty wouldn't even come within 10 meters of the carcass. He stayed in the tray of the ute, shivering. Sarah called the neighbor that afternoon. He came over with a tractor to bury it, looking at the carcass with a furrowed brow. "Probably a big boar," he muttered, scratching his chin. "They get massive up in the park. Can do a lot of damage if they're cornered." But a boar doesn't explain what Sarah found 3 days later. She was out behind the house yard, pushing the petrol lawnmower along the boundary fence. The house fence was standard ring lock wire to keep snakes and rabbits out of the garden. But just 5 meters past it was the old 4-strand barbed wire paddock fence that the kids used to climb through. As she turned the mower near the timber strainer post, she stopped. On the other side of the barbed wire fence, out in the big paddock where the grass started to slope down, someone had arranged a series of thick, heavy, black wattle branches. They weren't scattered by the wind. They had been deliberately broken into equal lengths, roughly 2 feet long each, and laid out on the dirt in a recurring geometric chevron pattern, pointing directly back up at the house windows. Sarah switched off the mower. The silence of the valley rushed back in, broken only by the crows calling from the dead gum trees near the creek. She walked over to the wire, staring down at the sticks. To break those branches required a grip that would strip the bark clean off, and the pattern was too neat, too deliberate. It felt like a marker, a boundary line drawn by something that was slowly moving its way up from the water, foot by foot, week by week. The breaking point came at the end of July. Sarah's parents had invited her and the kids down to Central Mangrove for a long weekend to get out of the mountain cold. She'd left Rusty with a mate down the road who ran a boarding kennel, packed the car, and spent 4 days surrounded by the noise of traffic, coastal air, and normal everyday life. For 4 days, her shoulders relaxed. She convinced herself she was just getting rural cabin fever, that the isolation of the tops was playing tricks on her mind. On the Tuesday night, she drove back up the mountain alone. She'd left the kids with their grandparents for another week until the school term started again, wanting to get the old house warmed up and the firewood split before they came home. She picked Rusty up from the kennel on her way past, the dog sitting in the passenger seat of the ute, his head resting on her lap. They turned off the bitumen onto the gravel access road at around 10 o'clock at night. The moon was a sliver of silver behind the mists, and the headlights of the ute cut through the dark, reflecting off the white frost on the grass paddocks. She pulled the truck up next to the kitchen veranda steps, switched off the ignition, and the headlights died. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. Sarah reached over to grab her overnight bag from the floorboards, but before her hand could touch the zipper, Rusty went rigid. The dog didn't growl. He let out a sharp, terrified yelp, his entire 30-kilo body trembling against her leg as he stared out the passenger side window toward the back fence line. Sarah looked through the glass. In the dim reflection of the dashboard light, she couldn't see the paddocks, but she heard it. Through the crisp, freezing mountain air, from the direction of the back timber gate just 30 meters away, came the sound of something heavy moving through the dry grass. It wasn't the 4-beat gait of a cow or a horse. It was a heavy, thudding, bipedal stride. Thud, thud, thud. Then came the sound of metal under tension. The old paddock fence, the high tensile barbed wire, gave a sharp, ringing ping as something massive shifted its weight against the top strand, stretching the rusted wire until the staples groaned in the timber posts. Panic hit Sarah like a physical drop in blood pressure. She didn't look back. She threw her door open, grabbed Rusty by the collar, and dragged him out of the cabin. They sprinted up the timber veranda steps, her keys jingling frantically in her hand as she tried to find the deadbolt in the dark. She threw the door open, shoved the dog inside, slammed the heavy cedar door shut, and turned the key just as the sound of something large moving through the garden gate echoed from the side of the house. She didn't turn on the lights. She knew that if she turned on the lights, the house would become a lantern in the valley, and whatever was outside would be able to see her through the glass. She sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, her back pressed against the lower cupboards, her arms wrapped tightly around Rusty's neck. The dog was hyperventilating, his nose tucked into her armpit, his body shivering so hard his collar tags were clicking against his chest. An hour passed. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. The house settled into the winter cold, the wood fire heater dead and empty. Then, at exactly midnight, the timber stairs at the front of the house creaked. It wasn't the sound of the timber expanding in the frost. It was a massive, concentrated weight pressing down on the edge of the bottom step. Creak. Then the second step. Creak. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering so violently against her ribs she was certain it would give her away. She listened as the footsteps moved onto the old hardwood flooring of the wraparound veranda. They were slow, deliberate, and incredibly heavy. Every plank of the old weatherboard house groaned as the weight shifted across it. The footsteps moved past the kitchen window. In the faint starlight, Sarah saw the silhouette cross the frosted pane. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, but carrying a thick, hunched shape that blocked out the entire lower half of the glass. It didn't walk like a man. It had a slight swaying momentum, its long, heavy arms occasionally brushing against the weatherboard siding of the house with a rough, coarse sound like heavy canvas dragging across sandpaper. It walked all the way around to the back laundry door. It stopped there for 20 minutes. Sarah sat frozen in the kitchen dark, listening to the sound of something large breathing through the gap under the door. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a pant. It was a deep, wet, rattling intake of air that smelled, even through the thick cedar timber of the gully. It was that same foul, ancient scent of rotting vegetation, stagnant creek water, and wet hide that the kids had smelled months ago. Every instinct in her body screamed to look out the window, to just get a glimpse of the face, to see if it was a man, to see if there was an explanation. But the sheer, primitive terror radiating off the dog pinned her to the floorboards. She knew that if she looked, and if whatever was on the other side of that glass looked back, she would never be able to live in that valley again. Around 4 in the morning, just as the first blue smudge of dawn began to crack the eastern sky over the national park, the weight shifted off the veranda boards. She heard the soft thud of it hitting the lawn, and then the long, rhythmic strides heading back down the slope toward the creek line. Sarah didn't wait for the sun to fully rise. As soon as there was enough light to see her car keys on the floor, she threw her bags back into the ute, whistled for Rusty, and left the property with the engine roaring, the tires spraying gravel across the main road. She drove straight to her parents' place down on the coast. She didn't give her neighbors an explanation, and she didn't call the police. When her mother asked why she was back so early, and why she looked like she hadn't slept in a week, Sarah just sat at the table, took a sip of hot tea, and picked up her mobile phone. She called her parents to tell them the kids were staying down there for the rest of the winter. She told them she'd handle the school transfers herself. And then she called a real estate agent in Dungog, telling them to put the 300 acres on the market by Friday. The agent asked if she wanted to come up to sign the paperwork, to take some photos of the old weatherboard house for the online listing. Sarah just looked out the window at the safe suburban street traffic of the coast, her hand still shaking against the kitchen table. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just sell it as is. Don't go down to the creek line. Just list the house, lock the gates, and don't look back." Thanks for listening to our 13th episode. A like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated, and means you won't miss out on the next episode. If you have any of your own Aussie stories you'd like us to read, drop us a line. Cheers from the Never Never.